Before she walked out that door with her suitcase wheels clicking against the hardwood, my wife turned around, smiled in a way I hadn't seen in months, and said, "We'll talk when I get back." I didn't ask where she was really going. I didn't ask why her phone had started facing screen down on every surface in our house. I just nodded, kissed her cheek, and let her go, because I already knew more than she thought I did, and I was done asking questions she wasn't going to answer honestly. If you're new here, this is the kind of story we tell on this channel. The slow, quiet unraveling that happens behind closed doors. The ones nobody sees coming until it's already over. So if stories like this pull you in, stay through this one because the ending isn't what you're expecting, and hit that subscribe button so you catch the next confession before it disappears into the feed. My name doesn't matter for this story, so I'll just tell you what I do. I work in compliance for a mid-sized logistics firm. The kind of job where my entire function is to notice when numbers don't add up, when a shipment manifest says one thing and the invoice says another, when a signature looks slightly off from the one on file. 11 years of doing that professionally does something to a person. You stop believing coincidences exist. You start seeing patterns everywhere, even in your own kitchen. My wife and I had been married 6 years. We met in our mid-20s, both broke, both ambitious, both convinced we were building something that would last. For a long time it did. We had the apartment, then the house, then the golden retriever that shed on everything, then the routine, Tuesday date nights, Sunday grocery runs, the whole quiet architecture of a life that works. The cracks started small, the way they always do. She picked up a new position at her company, marketing coordinator turned regional something or other, and the travel increased. First, it was 1 conference a quarter, then it was 2. Then it was a work trip that didn't have a name I recognized when I looked at her calendar, which she'd left open on the shared laptop one evening in early autumn. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't the suspicious husband checking her phone at 2 in the morning. I was just a man who happened to notice, the way I notice everything, that a hotel confirmation email had come through with a checkout date that didn't match what she'd told me. 2 extra nights. Unexplained. Filed away in my head the way I file away every inconsistency, waiting to see if it resolved itself or turned into something worse. It turned into something worse. By the end of that autumn, I had a mental ledger of small discrepancies. A receipt for a dinner for 2 in a city she said she visited alone. A text notification that flashed on her screen from a name saved only as initials at 11:40 at night that made her physically flinch when she saw I'd glanced at it. A new perfume in her bag that wasn't the one I'd bought her for our anniversary. None of it was proof of anything specific. All of it together was a pattern I couldn't unsee. I didn't confront her, and I want to explain why, because I think most people would have. It wasn't cowardice. It was strategy, and I'm not proud of how clinical that sounds, but that's genuinely how my mind works. In my job, when you suspect fraud, you don't announce your suspicion to the person you suspect. You gather documentation. You build a timeline. You wait until the picture is complete enough that there's no room left for a plausible explanation, because if you move too early, the person just adjusts their story, and you lose your only chance at the truth. So I watched. Quietly, without confrontation, without accusation, I started paying closer attention to everything. The hotel confirmations that occasionally auto-populated on our shared cloud calendar, the credit card statement I'd always glanced at but never scrutinized, the small tells in her voice when she talked about her work trips with just a beat too much detail, like she was performing normalcy instead of living it. By the end of that winter, I had enough to be certain, even without a signed confession. There was a colleague of hers, someone I'd met exactly twice at company holiday parties, a man with an easy laugh and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. His name showed up in her call log more than any of her actual friends. Their trips overlapped in cities that had no reason to host a regional marketing coordinator 2 months in a row. And once, just once, I found a photo she'd forgotten to delete from a shared album. Nothing explicit, nothing that would hold up as absolute proof in any court, just 2 people standing closer than colleagues stand, both of them laughing at something the camera didn't capture. I didn't cry over it. That surprised me at the time. I sat there at our kitchen table with my laptop open, and I felt something colder than grief, something closer to the feeling I get at work when I finally trace a fraudulent invoice back to its source, a kind of grim, quiet clarity. The case was closed. I just hadn't decided what to do with the verdict yet. Then came the trip. The one where she stood by the door with her suitcase and smiled at me like nothing was wrong and said, "We'll talk when I get back." I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because I did, for a long time after she left. We'll talk when I get back. Not, "I love you." Not, "I'll miss you." A promise of a future conversation, delivered with a smile, from a woman who was climbing into a rideshare to spend 4 days in another city with a man who wasn't her husband. I remember standing in the doorway watching the car pull away, and something in me just settled. Whatever conversation she thought we were going to have when she returned, I decided I was going to have a very different one. If you were standing in that hallway with me, watching her drive off after a sentence like that, would you have let it go and waited quietly, or would you have said something right then and there? I want you to actually think about that, because what I did next isn't something I'd recommend to everyone, and I want to know honestly whether you'd have done the same. I didn't destroy anything. I didn't do anything illegal, dramatic, or vindictive in the Hollywood sense. What I did was exactly what my job trained me to do for over a decade. I built a case, and then I built a boundary. The first thing I did was call a lawyer. Not to file anything yet, just to understand clearly and unemotionally what my position was. What counted as marital property, what didn't, what documentation would matter if this went the direction I suspected it would. I sat in that office on a Tuesday afternoon, took notes like I was in a compliance audit, and left with a folder of information that made the rest of the week feel less like heartbreak and more like project management. The second thing I did was quieter, and honestly, it's the part I think about the most now. I went through our house, our shared house, the one we'd picked out together, painted together, the one with her reading nook by the window and my home office in the converted garage, and I started separating what was mine from what was ours from what, frankly, I no longer wanted associated with my life. Not angrily, not throwing things into boxes at 3 in the morning while crying, the way movies show it. I did it the way I do everything, methodically. A little each evening after work, with a glass of water instead of whiskey, with a legal pad where I tracked which accounts needed to be separated, which subscriptions needed her name removed, which joint credit line needed to be frozen before she could rack up more unexplained hotel charges on my dime. I called her mother once during those 4 days, which I know might sound strange, but her mother and I had always gotten along, and I felt she deserved to hear things directly from me rather than through whatever version her daughter would eventually construct. I didn't accuse anyone of anything on that call. I just said calmly, "I think some things are about to change, and I wanted you to hear it from me first, not find out secondhand." She went quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I didn't expect. "I had a feeling. She's been different since spring." That confirmed something for me. I wasn't imagining a pattern that only existed in my own paranoid head. Other people had noticed it too. I also did something that, looking back, was probably the most important thing I did in those 4 days. I called my own therapist, someone I'd been seeing on and off for work stress for the past 2 years, and I asked for an emergency session. I sat in that office, and for the first time since I'd found that photo, I let myself actually feel something instead of just documenting it. I told her everything, the receipts, the calendar, the initials on the phone screen, the way my wife had started flinching when I looked at her too long. My therapist didn't tell me what to do. She just asked me one question that stuck with me. What do you actually want the outcome to be? And I realized, sitting there, that I didn't want revenge. I wanted the truth to exist in the open, finally, instead of hidden behind polite smiles and vague promises about talking later. By day 3, the house didn't look dramatically different to a casual observer, but if you knew what to look for, the way I know what to look for in a fraudulent shipping manifest, you'd see it. Her side of the closet had space in it that hadn't been there before, not empty, just organized in a way that made it clear which items were staying and which were going. The joint checking account had a new secondary savings account siphoned off from it, one she didn't have access to. Her name had quietly been removed as an authorized user on the credit card I'd opened years before we married. I hadn't changed the locks. I want to be clear about that, because I think some men in my position would have, and I genuinely believe that would have been an overreach before we'd even spoken. I wasn't punishing her preemptively. I was just making sure that when the conversation she'd promised finally happened, it happened on ground that reflected reality, instead of the fiction she'd been maintaining. She came home on a Sunday evening. I remember the exact sound of her key in the lock, the particular rhythm of it, because I'd heard it 1,000 times before, and it had always meant something comforting. That evening, it just sounded like a clock ticking toward something inevitable. She walked in with her suitcase, sunburned slightly across her nose the way she always got even in cooler weather, and she called out, "Hey, I'm back," in a voice that still had that same performed lightness from 4 days earlier. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd built my entire case, with the folder closed in front of me and a cup of coffee going cold beside it. "Hey," I said. Just that. Calm. She came into the kitchen, dropped her bag by the door, and I watched her eyes do a slow sweep of the room. The same instinct I have, actually, though I don't think she realized that about herself. She noticed something was different before she could articulate what. Maybe it was the folder. Maybe it was my posture. Maybe it was just the silence, which in 6 years of marriage had never once felt like this. "You okay?" she asked, and there was the first real crack in her voice. "I'm fine," I said. "You said we'd talk when you got back. I think we should talk now." She sat down slowly across from me, and I watched her face run through about 4 different expressions in the span of 10 seconds. Casual confusion, forced warmth, a flicker of something closer to fear, and then a kind of resigned stillness, like she already knew, somewhere underneath the performance, that this wasn't going to go the way she'd rehearsed on the flight home. "Okay," she said quietly. "Talk." I didn't yell. I want to be really clear about that because I think there's a version of this story people expect where I slam the folder down and scream accusations across the table. That's not what happened. I opened the folder, turned it around so it faced her, and I said, "I know about the hotel in the city you told me you were visiting alone. I know about the second set of charges on the joint card from a restaurant for 2. I know his name shows up in your call log more than mine does most weeks. And I know you weren't at a work conference this weekend because I called the front desk of the hotel you listed, and there was no marketing conference scheduled there this month." Her face went completely still. Not shocked, exactly. More like the specific stillness of someone who's been caught mid-performance and doesn't know which line to say next. "I can explain," she started, and I held up a hand, not aggressively, just enough to stop her. "You don't have to explain the details," I said. "I already know most of them. What I actually want to know is why you thought I wouldn't notice. Because I noticed months ago. I've known since autumn. I just didn't say anything because I wanted to see if it would end on its own, or if you'd tell me the truth before I had to ask." She started crying then, quietly. The kind of crying that comes from being exposed rather than from genuine remorse, and I recognized the difference immediately, the way you recognize a forged signature once you've seen enough real ones. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said. "It started as just talking, just someone who actually listened when I talked about work, and then it turned into something I didn't know how to stop." I didn't comfort her. I want to be honest about that too, because I think a lot of people in my position would have softened at the tears, and maybe 6 months earlier I would have. But I'd spent 4 days building a boundary out of documentation and calm, deliberate action, and I wasn't going to let tears dissolve something I'd built that carefully. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," I told her. "I've separated the accounts that need separating. I'm not asking you to explain yourself so I can decide whether to forgive you. I already decided what I need to do. I just wanted you to hear it directly from me, the way you said we would, instead of finding out through paperwork." She sat there in silence for a long time after that. I remember the dog wandering in from the living room, confused by the tension, resting his head on her knee like he could sense something had shifted permanently in that house. Neither of us said anything for what felt like several minutes. In the months that followed, the fallout was exactly as unglamorous as real fallout usually is. There was no screaming match, no dramatic public confrontation with the other man, nothing that would make for a satisfying movie scene. There was a separation agreement, drafted carefully, argued over small details neither of us really cared about but felt obligated to fight for anyway. There was the slow, administrative process of dividing a shared life into 2 separate ones, closing joint accounts, splitting furniture, figuring out custody of a dog who didn't understand why his routine had changed. She lost more than the marriage in the end. Word travels in smaller professional circles than people think, and within her own company, whispers about the situation eventually reached people who mattered for her career trajectory. She didn't get fired, nothing that dramatic happened, And I want to be fair here, because I never went out of my way to sabotage her professionally. That was never the point. But the promotion she'd been angling for that year quietly went to someone else, and the colleague she'd been seeing transferred to a different regional office not long after, which I later learned wasn't entirely his choice. As for me, I kept the house. I kept the dog, most weekends. I went back to therapy regularly instead of just when things reached crisis level, and I learned slowly how to let myself feel things in real time instead of filing them away and processing them only once the case was fully built. That's been the harder part, honestly, not the divorce itself, but relearning how to trust my own emotional reactions instead of treating every relationship like something that needs to be audited for inconsistencies before I allow myself to feel anything at all. I still think about that moment in the doorway sometimes, her smiling and saying we'll talk when I get back, like it was a small, harmless promise instead of the last sentence of a marriage that had already quietly ended weeks before either of us said it out loud. So here's what I keep coming back to, and what I genuinely want to know from you. What do you think was actually going through her mind in that doorway, smiling like that, already halfway into a different life while I stood there already halfway out of ours? Was she convinced she'd get away with it, or some part of her already knew the conversation waiting for her when she came home wouldn't be the one she was expecting? Tell me what you think in the comments, and if you want, let me know what kind of story you'd like to hear next on this channel, because there are more of these, and some of them go even further than this one did.